Hi, Nantali.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Welcome to Chosen Family.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to have you both meet.
Yeah, I'm so happy. I'm so
I am too,
excited.
and I had no idea that Thomas felt this way about me. So I feel
Oh,
I
well, just
feel
take
like
it in.
blushing.
So one thing about you, so you work at the CBC,
I
but you're
do.
also a MC and singer, and
Yeah,
that story because I was doing a bit more research because I've met you only in recent years,
yeah,
and how you started as a backup singer in that hip
yeah.
hop band.
It was very accidental. I had no intention to be a performer. I think as a child, I probably was very much a performer, and I studied music as a child and played the piano, played the trombone. But my parents are from the Caribbean, immigrants to Quebec. They've been here for 50, almost 60 years. But the idea of going into the arts as a professional thing was not an option unless it was obvious that I was some sort of genius. It wasn't going to happen. So I kind of put that notion behind me very soon in life. But I was always attracted to the arts and the hip hop community for sure. Hip hop culture. I grew up in that sort of 80s era, 90s era of hip hop. So when I ended up in Nomadic Massive, it was really accidental. I was friends with people in the band. It was 2005. Um, and I just happened to be humming harmonies.
It's
Yeah.
literally the storyline of a
That
movie, like the girl in the back humming the harmonies, and then the band's
It's
like,
very glitter.
right?
It's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
Mariah
Yeah, I
glitter.
should be wearing like
yeah,
this like little shawl or something and I'm all demure and then all of a sudden I break out.
yeah.
Yeah, it was something like that. And so they said to me, "Oh my gosh, could you do that on stage in a show?" And I thought, "What? No way." And 14 years later,
You're still doing it.
yeah.
You're still doing it. I
Yeah.
remember I saw an interview. You have this necklace. It says "I am
Black
Black
girl.
Girl,"
Yeah.
and in this era of identity politics, like how do you? Because it must be so interesting for someone like you who's been
Mm.
involved in identity politics and sort of doing community work
Mhm.
with youth here in Montreal. Like looking at this recent wave of people getting aware of who they are.
Yeah.
How do you find that?
I'm so excited by
Yeah.
this. I am because in my era of being a young, like teenager or young adult, and those questions, we were trying to address those questions. The platforms weren't necessarily accessible to
Mm.
have that expression. And I met a young man this weekend on my show. I host a show called The
The
Bridge
bridge.
on
It just
CBC.
started.
It just started.
Yeah.
It used to be a different kind of show at the same time slot, but we've been working on a different format. And so I had a guest in, an artist, a visual artist from Toronto, and he's 30, and he's a part of a movement called the Black Speculative Arts Movement, and it's all about bringing together Black artists in North America, and he's working on basically the Canadian leg, who are thinking about Black identity in the future and illustrating that in their artwork, be it visual arts or whatever form. And he said something to me about his generation. He says, "I think we're just more audacious right now."
Mm.
And I was thinking about that because Lido Pimienta had just
Mhm.
won the Polaris, and she was really bold and brazen on stage in front of this huge
Yeah.
industry. And I'm thinking, this is amazing that young people, people of color, people who for whatever reason have felt marginalized, feel like they can take ownership and agency.
'Cause
My generation, sometimes we managed to do it, sometimes we didn't, but I find the numbers now
but
Mm.
are great.
you've been in the trenches.
I've been in the
In
trenches.
the trenches, meeting with like for over a decade,
Yeah.
for like almost 20 years,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
meeting with like people like kids in school,
Yes.
doing
Yeah.
work with Nomadic Massive.
Absolutely. I have to shout out my homegirl, Maryse Le Gagneur.
Yeah.
She's a Quebecoise filmmaker of Haitian origins, and by luck, she asked me to work with her on a project that was all about demystifying stereotypes around
Mm.
hip hop culture. And she was determined to bring this into the classroom, not like an after school program or something. And we really wanted to make it about almost history and media and understanding how hip hop culture fits into the story of hip hop. How does that fit into the bigger story of where we are in life and how did we get there?
Do you feel today that we speak about it more than only in February for Black History Month? Or
Uh,
it's still very, like it's going to be
yeah.
that day and then,
Yeah. Well, so that was something that we pushed against when we started
of course.
hip hop no pop, or in French it was called hip hop sans la pop when we started in 2007. Going into the first school we went to was Joseph François Perrault
Yeah.
in Saint
Saint
Michel.
Michel, yeah.
And we made a point of trying to make sure that whenever we brought that project, which was 4 workshops over the course of a month, and we wanted to get to as many students as possible, and we wanted to be in the classroom, we made sure it happened not in February. And
Yeah.
of course, we ran up on some weird circumstances. They were like, "Where are your costumes? Why are you not dancing?"
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
You know,
Right.
and where's your, hat backwards and your big gold chain? And that's not what our project was
Yeah.
about at all. It was about critical thinking. But people felt a need for it and kept calling us, and we kept going, and then we went to other places with it outside of Montreal, outside of Quebec, and different contexts. So yeah, it's been great.
I know I don't want to speak for Tranna, but as like women in comedy are always, always, always asked the same old tiring questions.
Yeah,
Like,
like, what is it like?
and I'm sure
About
the
women in
same
music?
thing
Yeah.
with women in music and women in hip
Especially
hop.
in hip hop,
Yeah.
My question is, what do we do for people to stop asking those questions? Like to just move forward? Do we stop answering? Do we?
Yeah. I think it's like
Because it's embarrassing mostly for the people who ask at this
I
point.
think it's a two-way street, right? We also need to, like, if people feel they have something to say about being a woman in said sort of male-dominated space, I think
Let's say for you in
sure.
hip hop.
But for me in hip hop, I think people stopped asking me that question because very early on, I remember being on a panel at Pop Montreal, and I was with Eternia, Miriam Sassy, who's also in Nomadic, and Mishimi, who's like Canadian legend
Yeah.
in hip hop. And myself and Miriam, our answers were probably super unexpected. This was like 2008. It'd been about 3 years that we were in the band. And I just said, well, we're really lucky that we're surrounded by brothers
Yeah.
who
It
check
feels
they
like
check
that.
for us.
It really feels
And
like
so
that.
it's like the guys in our group, we write our own lyrics and they rap our lyrics with us as the same way that you would back up
Yeah.
another person in the group. They're always putting us we're not last. Like in the 80s and in the 90s, I felt like some women who were affiliated to a crew, let's say a hip hop crew, and they were MCs. It was like, dun dun dun, here she is, and then
Right.
all of a sudden this female MC comes out and she's like our I don't know, our dog or
Right.
Yeah.
our special juju or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. And it was so bizarre when I think about that. And I'm like, she got better lyrics than all of y'all,
Yeah.
So for me personally, of course, there are things that can happen, but the context that Nomadic operates in, rarely are we faced with any kind of misogyny or sexism because the hip hop that we make is not about that. So the
Right.
people who gravitate to us are not about that. And if ever it happens that way, we just
Yeah.
know how to deal with it.
'Cause let's talk about Nomadic Massive because you guys have been trailblazers on so many levels.
Thank you.
So many levels. Rapping with live instruments was
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
The use of many languages
Yes.
is another. I want to talk about the themes.
Yes.
Because you talked about colonial power before it was trendy. Because now it's kind of trendy to talk about colonial
I
power
guess
in a
so.
way, in a
Yeah.
weird internet
Yeah.
viral way.
Which is a good thing that it's
It's a
becoming,
Of course.
one of the forefront discussions.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you guys have been on it for
sure.
since the
And
beginning.
I mean, we have to be straight up. We're old. like we're older because I don't want to offend anybody in the group who might feel like, what is she talking about, Sally? But I'm like one of the oldest people in the group,
Okay.
and most of us have a particular aesthetic when it came to hip hop culture. I was growing up in Montreal, in Côte-des-Neiges, in the 80s, in the early 90s, when X-Clan was a really important band in hip hop culture. Public Enemy was really important, and they were already talking about that kind of stuff in the 80s and 90s. So those things, those themes and those kinds of bands, even Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul, those bands really informed the kind of hip hop that I was attracted to and what I was thinking about. It also has a lot to do with my own family background and those topics, my relationship with those topics. So for me to talk about anything else just would feel unnatural to me. And I think to many of the people in the group, because even though we're this visually people would say, oh, there's like 2 white guys in that group and 1 Latino guy and like 3 black people and this
How
Arab
many
girl.
are you?
Well, we are the original probably were about 8 people who started that crew. DJ Static from We
It's
Funk.
really a chosen family.
Yeah, yeah.
That was my reasoning behind
Yeah,
wanting
yeah.
to talk to
Tribe.
you.
Yes, it really was a tribe. And now some people have shifted out. As we said, we're older, so life changes. And so now we've got like a core 6 who were there since like 2004, 2005. But we all have a story of displacement linked to us.
Yeah.
And because of that story, and be it our parents were displaced or we were literally displaced or we felt displaced even wherever we were being raised, as would be my story, that talking about those types of heavy topics just were normal for us.
What is your story of displacement?
Yeah, what's my story of displacement? I grew up in Côte d'Ivoire, and my mother came to Canada in 1959, and she came from the Caribbean, from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. My father was already in the United States and had come here to go to school. And they grew up in an era in the Caribbean where, their countries were still colonies under British rule. And so there were certain things about the education system that they were accustomed to by the time they got to Canada. Montreal was also shifting. Quebec was also shifting at that point as well, but the English were still very dominant here. So in my mother's mind, in terms of education, I had to get a certain quality of education, and she wanted to make sure she'd find it in the right schools. The neighborhood school was a great school, but what my mother witnessed, she was worried that because it was predominantly black, like black students and children of color, of immigrants, she was worried that we were going to get shortchanged at that school. And around that time in the 80s, people start to witness as well, like, what's up with all these black boys going to special ed? Like, how come all of a sudden all these young black boys have some issue with learning? It looked like people were experiencing some form of institutional racism.
Right.
So my mother sent me to school in Westmount, at Roslyn Elementary School, and that was already a bizarre situation to grow up in because all of my friends lived in the neighborhood. I lived across the street from the neighborhood school. I went to day camp. I was very much a part of the English black community in Côte d'Ivoire. We went to church on Côte St. Catherine Street, and then I didn't end up going to school with all my friends. And we were about, throughout the 6 years that I was at Roslyn, we were maybe 5 black kids in the French immersion program. So that displacement was almost a daily thing for me because I didn't always see the people that I knew. And it wasn't just about race. It was also about socioeconomics. It was also, I lived in a community with Southeast Asian people, Vietnamese people, and
So are we
Moroccans.
talking about the same area as Sugar Sammy, basically?
Exactly.
Same
Yeah.
sort of multicultural,
diverse,
early 90s.
And more people were second generation. Like more of us were, our parents had all immigrated here, and yet in Westmount, these are people who had been there.
Right.
Their families have been there for a really long time.
So many identities. So there's the
Yeah.
Montreal identity for
Yes.
you. There's the Caribbean identity.
Yeah.
There's the Canadian identity.
Yeah.
Do you think
There's a
about
hint-
it do you think about it that separately? How conscious of you? How
so
conscious are you of
about
all of
those-
these identities?
It took me, I think at this point, where I'm at in my life, I'm also a mom. At this point in my life, I'm thinking less about those identities, but I certainly have. It's always there for me because in the moments where I feel like, oh, I'm not really connecting.
Like, are you connecting to the Quebecois identity, for example?
Well, it depends on where I am.
Yeah.
I went to school in Ontario just before going to university in Ontario, and a funny experience happened. I was was in the cafeteria, and it was before the school day was going to start, and they sing the national anthem at this high school.
Oh, Canada.
Oh, Canada. And they pray before the day
Yeah.
starts.
That's not
And
a
I
Quebec.
was, at all. And so I was sitting down. I was just like, okay, well, this is what they do. And people were offended, and I just thought,
Oh, wow.
and the other time that I saw that was also when I was in university. I was at the University of Ottawa. Canada Day. I ended up spending Canada Day in Ottawa. I had never experienced Canada Day like that.
Right.
It was like, I was like, what? This is not
So you felt more Quebecer
I felt more
outside of
Quebecer
Quebec,
in those
yeah.
moments,
Right.
right?
Okay.
Then when I'm here, it's tricky. It's tricky when I'm
Yeah.
here because so much of my identity is about being a Black Canadian person.
Yeah.
I feel like I spend a lot of time reflecting on that because I feel like there's a lot of work to be done
Yeah.
around that for more people.
How is that? It's going to sound very basic, but
Go ahead.
how is that identity different from Black American, for African American?
For African American, well, so those of us there are people who are Black Canadians who have a direct lineage to Black Americans who were slaves who came up to Canada and escaped slavery at some point and landed in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, in parts of Montreal. Some people further west, Windsor, Chatham, and then even further west into the prairie provinces. But then a big chunk of people who are considered Black Canadian or African Canadian, I think that's like the UN term, a big chunk of people are people who came here as a result of immigration. And then that gets broken down into
Right.
waves, right? Like which community came at what time from what
And
parts
in
of the
Montreal,
Caribbean.
the Haitian community is so
It's such
important.
a big community, So there's that distinction to be made because my family came here from the Caribbean already with a very strong sense of self.
Right.
And if you were to speak to Caribbean people of a certain generation, like my parents' generation, 60 plus, they often say, I didn't know I was Black until I came here because I'm juxtaposed. And the Caribbean is extremely mixed. There are white people in the Caribbean, Asian people, all kinds. But the idea of like being othered, they didn't realize that was, they didn't notice that until
Yeah.
they came here. And that's going to for sure inform how their children understand their
Right.
identities, right? And so there's that distinction as well. The Black Americans have a story around slavery that has been documented and sort of addressed and discussed and plays a huge part in how they operate in the United States,
Yeah.
how they exist in the United States, how the United States runs their government, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
It's all linked to that story. Whereas it's different for Black Canadians, although there are some, definitely in terms of politics and governance and even in the law. I found this out in a series I did at CBC called
Yeah.
Breaking the Code, where we learned about color laws within the legal system in Canada.
Canada,
But
yeah.
that stuff is not so readily accessible.
That's
Right.
the thing. We seem to like to think that Canadians are above what's going on in
Right.
the U.S., but
Yeah.
it's a different
It
kind
totally is a
Yeah.
different thing.
Well, I read this interview that you had done in the beginning of 2016, that sort of addressed that. And, I think the journalist had asked you, do you think that we've sort of made it through? And obviously not. But what you had said was racism might not be as in our face or as aggressive as it once was, but it's always there. It has always been there, and it is still there.
Yeah.
And that was before shit really hit the
Yeah,
fan.
yeah.
And now, speaking about this moment where it wasn't in your face, and now everything is just like coming out.
Yeah.
How has that affected your life, just personally and professionally,
But do
in
you
the
think,
work
like,
that you do?
But don't you think that like things really hit the fan for just white people? It's been, you know what I
Right.
mean? Like I feel
Right.
for African Americans and probably for
Right.
African Canadians, it's
Yeah.
Well, do you
it's
see a
just
difference in people's attitudes towards you and what you do
Yeah.
before DT and post DT?
there's DT and then there's Black Lives Matter also a few years
exactly.
ago.
Oh, this is great.
I mean, it's like we have to
topics.
talk about it, but like, how do you
Absolutely.
find your way into it? It's such an overwhelming topic.
Yeah.
but
Because you've moderated a lot of panels about racial diversity in Canada, about First Nations in Canada. So you have your own experience, but you have also the experience of, as a broadcaster, like listening to people, giving people a chance to speak. So how do you position yourself in all of this?
Well, I think the work around diversity and inclusion and racism, which has a lot to do with skin color, but that's not what racism is. It's about power and control, right? And so we're using this notion of skin color to try and control said group. There's always going to be work around that. Because we haven't yet gotten to the crux of where is this actually really coming from? And in some ways, it's too far back for people to have to like wade through, right?
Yeah.
But I think it also has a lot to do with, are we actually addressing our own challenges and our discomforts, which is what I think you're referring to, Real Talk on Race, which was a series that I produced at CBC, where we really were trying to get everyone engaged, anyone, even the journalists and the reporters and our guests, to try to get at sort of how are we living race? I remember we really wanted to have a conversation about, what does it mean to be white right now, and how does that feel? And that was a hard thing to try to get off the ground, because that meant like some white people would have to really be like, actually, I'm not sure, or actually, yeah, I hate it right now, which are things that I heard that people did say, but didn't necessarily feel comfortable bringing it forward. For myself, I have to say that it's great to see that more people are in tune to some of the challenges and the issues and the frustrations that people of color have been expressing. It's, of course, the more people, the better. And I just hope that people who are engaging in that work, who are sort of, as we say, maybe are getting woke right now, can turn back and say to the people who were prior to them talking about this, can turn back and say, like, you know what, we need to include you here. We need to hear your expertise. And I think that's a big thing that we're trying to achieve here in Canada as well, is that it starts with Indigenous people here and First Nations people here. So we need to turn to them for their wisdom around how are they dealing, how are they working, what do they need, to understand how the rest of us who may feel marginalized can get through it as well.
Right. Because the challenge, in a way, I'm a white guy, but I'm a queer guy, and in a way, it's like, how do we keep what's different about us and sort of bring it all together and all the perspectives and listen to each other, but it's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah.
And we've seen it in the American election with white women, mostly going for DT.
Right.
Yeah. And I think
the DT is like what we say.
Well, I mean, I don't know. There's part of me that wants chosen family and sort of everything that I do creatively to sort of be a refuge from him. Because it's just...
I wanted to talk about Melania, but Tranna
I know, I was like, no, we can't. And you still found a way to bring her out. But
I hear you. It's interesting.
Not to ignore what's happening, because I think he's
I totally hear you.
He's not, he's not the be-all, end-all of the problem. I just think we need to talk about the real issues and what's happening, but we can do that without talking about him.
There's a line in the last Nomadic Massive record. I think it's
like,
the world is a trickery. Or something like that, and one of the first songs, the word trickery really was like
I think that might be Miriam's verse in Pan Am.
Yeah, that's it.
I think so. Yeah,
and that word, it's
trickery.
Trickery. It just resonated. It just it's all trickery.
Yeah.
It is
kind
of complicated, right?
It is complicated.
It's smoke. It's sort of smoke and screens, and
But how do you, for example, with you, how do you raise a child in this?
Oh man,
how do you
that's a good question.
With a lot of love.
Yeah,
a lot of love that creates confidence. And I am grateful that I've always been surrounded by, not just in my family, my immediate family, but I've always been surrounded by people who believe in speaking up. Speaking up, speaking out, but not necessarily with a notion of self-righteousness or even over aggression, just about saying human to human, you know what? That's not cool. Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whatever the context is, you know? And so
That takes courage.
it does
Yeah.
take courage. But I guess I have to say that I've been fortunate to just have that in my lineage and in my circle all the time.
Yeah.
So that I trust that we can pass that message on to our son, and that he can just sort of operate in the same vein. I cannot say that I'm not worried about raising a black boy or a black child, or any child who would end up feeling marginalized for some reason. You worry about that as a parent, because you don't want your child to be ostracized for any reason, but you do want your child to know how to speak up and speak out and stand up for themselves, or at least share that with you so you could advocate.
Right. Well, speaking of children, like you mentioned earlier, that question of, where does this hatred come from? Like, where does prejudice and bigotry come from? And it goes back a long way. But there's a part of me that, because people, especially white people, love to try to find ways to justify the existence, the survival of racism and bigotry for all marginalized people. And I find that kind of rhetoric always angers me, because I would like to believe that on some level, we're born with the knowledge of love and acceptance, and you work with kids and you have a child. Do you see that? Like,
But
do you
we're
think
also
that
born
that's
with the knowledge of power.
power has never interested me.
Well,
I don't know. Like,
so that's I love the way you set up that question, because I see both love and power. And they both kick in very early. You feel as a parent that your child loves you just from every single moment that they smile at you, touch you, hold you, whatever. And then you also see when your child is vying for power with you or with another child. And that's that sort of animal instinct that as human species, we sort of are supposed to like elevate beyond that and learn and train and study and be more sophisticated than like, let me grab that from you, I got power, or like, let me push you out of the way because I want to get somewhere. That's a real thing that children do.
Right.
And we have the responsibility to teach them why not to do that.
Yeah.
And the people who struggle with that as adults maybe struggled with it as a child.
But there's just so many adults struggling with that it's crazy. Like the idea that an adult can have that, survival instinct kick in just because they think someone of some kind of minority is getting what they think they should have.
It's about feeling threatened is a real human condition.
I guess there's a part of it that I just will never be able to wrap my head around.
Some people would think that more equality means taking something away from them.
Right.
And I think it's just what we're dealing with as people, as long as they understand it this way, that needs to change.
And we need to spend a lot of time unpacking. I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine. He's a comedian and educator, Habib Siam. And he is... I'm going to out you right now, Habib. He loves Bomani Jones, who is a sportscaster. Like, he's obsessed. Like, he sent me a list of how they are identical, right? They don't even know each other, but they're identical. That's his twin. And he sent me this podcast, this conversation where Bomani was talking about this is just after the Charlottesville incidents, and LeBron James had spoken out, and people were using the language of shaming, and he said, well, shaming doesn't work. The idea of shaming just doesn't work. And what is the point of shaming people when they're never going to respond to that? Because you risk actually building a lot of animosity and anger. And I believe it's about unpacking things. We were in classrooms with Hip Hop No Pop where, to the question, why do you think there was an African slave trade? I remember a grade 8 student at a high school in Outremont here in Montreal who said, well, because, Africans always need jobs, and so maybe they wanted to help them. And so, okay, both of you have this surprise face, right? What shocked you about that answer?
I mean, it's not that it's shocking, because
it's mostly that someone would go through the education system thinking that.
Right?
Yeah.
And just this distinction, like they need this.
Right.
You know?
So my concern was like, hold on a second, we're talking about the 16th, 17th,
Yeah.
18th century, and you're talking to me about UNICEF commercials? Like,
Right.
that made me nervous,
Yeah.
first of all, about
Yeah.
critical thought. But with regards to the idea, I was like, all right, this is a young mind. This young mind has been impressioned.
Yeah.
By who and by what? By things that she has seen, things that people are telling her, or things that people are not telling her. And so we just had to take the time. I couldn't cut her down.
Right.
I couldn't say, what kind of stupid answer is that?
Yeah.
I had to just say, I understand why you're saying that,
Right.
but let's just look at what we're talking about. We're talking about a certain era. We've already established certain things about why this business.
So maybe we need more patience in the world.
We need so much more patience. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We do.
I feel like you're a very patient person because I just get like, I mean, I've been thinking
not.
about it. I'm not at all because I just get like, I'm just frustrated and I'm blown away by people like you who have this composure and this ability to think rationally and take the time to unpack and to actually, you know, to spend a chunk of your time trying to change the
But
mentality.
we didn't talk about your father, but it not only from him, but
Yeah,
his
thank you
story.
for that.
Because my reaction is just always like, can we just shut this shit down? Like, it's enough.
Inditi, go away.
In my private conversations, maybe I
Yeah.
sound like that. No, I am patient, but yeah, you were going to mention.
Because your
something.
father, would you say that your father was an activist? Is an activist?
My father, no. It's not that I don't. So my father was a student at Concordia in 1968. Concordia was called Sir George Williams at that time. And my father was a student trying to get to med school. He's from Petit Martinique, which is an island that belongs to Grenada. And he had been in the United States for a while and then went to school there and came up here to pursue post-secondary education. And my mom and my aunts and everybody who was around at that time, when my father took a stance, he took a stance with other students who accused a professor of racism, a teacher that was just systematically failing them, and they couldn't understand why, because these were students who were asked to come here on scholarship. You can't just get out of the Caribbean in the 1960s and be like, hey, anybody just come. You have to really fight for that. So they took action. They accused this teacher. They expected some sort of investigation by the university. It didn't quite go down that way. It went down the route of a protest that the rest of the student body at Concordia at the time did jump in and support these Black students. And for sure, when you see the footage of these big speeches and you see interviews,
it was a big deal.
It was a big deal. There was a fire on the 9th floor of the Hall building on Maisonneuve Street. And that time, that was in the computer room where computers were the size of this room. And those computer cards, you know, the university lost a lot of money. Tons of questions around who set the fire, how. The police had come in. Some people who were, you know, there to kind of stir the pot, they also infiltrated the scene. So there's tons of questions around that. A documentary came out about it recently. So that history is out there now, 9th floor. And I remember my mother growing up throughout my life because I ended up not.
Was that story part of your family mythology?
Absolutely. Yeah. I didn't grow up for a long time with my dad. My dad had to leave Canada and my parents went to Africa for a while and then came back to North America, but my father couldn't come back here. And my mother made a choice and raised me here instead of New York. So I only spent, you know, a little bit of time with my father in the end, not a lot of time. He's still alive, but we just didn't have that relationship. And my mother and my family were like, they weren't militants. They weren't activists. They just wanted justice.
Yeah.
And so we tend to take those labels because so many people, I guess, end up feeling passive or feeling like they're not really participating in affecting change. And then when people do step out because of what they feel they have to lose in all of it, they're like considered activists. And yes, there are things that my father did, and I learned this actually, interestingly, when the film came out, where people came to me who were teenagers in like Little Burgundy, who were Black Canadians who said, you know, I remember your father used to come to the Negro Community Center and talk to us about racism and civil rights, because that was also a time, right? The 68, 69, 67, there was something going on with university students. There were student protests all over the world. There was the war, Martin Luther King, all that stuff was in the air. And so they were participating in those conversations in Canada too, and bringing it to young Black Canadians who probably felt like they didn't have an opportunity to hear that stuff or think about that stuff or feel ownership around that. So in some ways, I totally understand why he would be perceived that way. I just don't think that he actually thought of himself in that way.
Right.
These were just people who were like, I have something to lose here, and I'm not going to let somebody else just throw it away.
And you don't like that word for yourself, right? Activist?
Yeah, no, I don't. I always wonder, and I respect, because for me, some of the people who are, to me, activists are 24/7 on that grind at the front line.
Yeah.
And I've been at the front line in different circumstances. And we could always sort of, you can define it how you want. Some people say, well, you're an activist, Tally, because you're going into schools and you're trying to push back. And so I understand that. But I also know people who really risk their lives.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it could be argued that I take that risk with regards to certain things I might say or certain things that I want to present, especially in the context of being in the media. But yeah, I just feel like, those of us who are fighting for those things are just people who want justice, and we all should want that. It's about humanity. Right?
And what do you think is most effective to affect change between hip hop and broadcasting?
Oh man, it's simultaneous. I think we need both. I think we need all things at the same time. Affecting change has to come from all angles. It has to come from, your daily conversations with your neighbor who otherwise you wouldn't talk to for whatever reason. Affecting change has to come at the very top, and somebody at the top saying like, wait a minute, let's take a moment and reflect here. Let's look at ourselves and see, what are we doing? What are we, and if we don't understand what we're doing, let's look over here and ask these people to join the conversation. Affecting change requires people to shake it up.
Yeah.
Right? Because those moments when people are shaking things up forces the rest of us to ask a question. We're seeing that right now with what's going on in the NFL.
Yeah.
One person decided to really shake things up. Or I don't even think he knew that he was going to shake things up in the way that he did. But look at where the conversation has gone as a result of kneeling down during a professional football game,
Yeah. Well, thank you for shaking up Chosen Family.
So amazing to have you. It was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll listen to your show, The Bridge,
Yes.
on the CBC in Quebec every Saturday at 5.
5 to 6, 88.5 FM, Radio 1.
Thank you, Nantali.
Thank you.